The night sky was dark and silent, and the stars were shining like tiny diamonds, but suddenly something changed, and a bright object appeared in the sky, and it was not a star or a plane, and it moved slowly like it was alive, and people on Earth looked up, and they were confused and scared and curious, and the object came closer and closer, and it was huge and glowing and shaped like a living creature, and not like a normal spaceship. Scientists in space centers all over the world were watching the object, and their screens were blinking, and alarms were ringing, and they could not understand what they were seeing, and they said, "This is not metal and not technology, and it is something new, and it is something dangerous and beautiful." At the same time, news spread fast, and cameras turned to the sky, and people gathered in streets and rooftops and fields, and they were all looking at the sky with wide eyes and holding their breath, and waiting for what will happen next. And then it happened. Object stopped above the capital city, and it opened like a flower, and a beam of light came down from the center, and from that light a figure slowly floated down, and she was tall and shining, and she looked like a queen, and her skin was silver, and her eyes were glowing blue, and her hair floated like it was under water, and she was not wearing armor or weapons, and still she looked powerful and strong and calm. People were shocked and amazed, and some fell to their knees, and some started crying, and some just stared without blinking. And the queen raised one hand, and the air became quiet, and even the wind stopped, and then she spoke, and her voice echoed inside every head and every heart. She said, "I have traveled far across the galaxy, and I have seen many worlds and many kinds of life. But now I come to you humans, and I bring a gift, and I offer myself to your kind, and I offer peace and strength and beauty. And I seek one human who is worthy, and I will become his companion and his queen." The world went silent, and then the world went wild, and leaders and scientists and celebrities and soldiers all started speaking at once, and everyone wanted to be chosen, and everyone wanted the alien queen to notice them, and they prepared gifts and events and interviews, and they dressed in their finest clothes, and the queen sat in her ship and watched, but far away from the lights and the cameras and the rich buildings. In a small corner of the city, a man named David was working in his little garage, and he was fixing a broken fan, and he was listening to the news on a small radio, and he shook his head and said to himself, "This is crazy, and people lose their minds too easily," and he turned off the radio and stepped outside. For some air in the dark alley behind his garage, he saw something move, and at first he thought it was a dog or a drunk man, but then he looked closer and he saw it was not human, and it was not like the queen either, and it was small and dirty and shaking and afraid, and it had strange wounds, and its skin was pale purple and cracked, and its clothes were torn, and its eyes were large and full of fear and pain. David took a step back, but the creature fell to the ground, and it reached one hand toward him and made a weak sound like a whisper, and then it fainted, and David stood frozen for a moment, and then he ran inside and brought a blanket and water, and he said, "I don't know what you are, but I'm not leaving you here," and he lifted the alien woman in his arms, and she was light like feathers and cold like ice. As he carried her inside, the lights of the queen's ship were still shining in the sky, and people were still dancing and shouting and hoping, and no one saw the broken one, and no one cared for the weak one, but David did. And in that moment something changed, and the stars above were watching, and they knew that the true story was not about the queen. The alien woman opened her eyes for 1 second and looked at David, and her lips moved, and she said one word, and it was quiet and shaking, but clear, and she said, "Queen," and then she closed her eyes again, and David stood still, and a chill ran down his spine, and he looked at the sky, and then at her, and he whispered, "What are you, and what happened to you?" And the story truly began not with the arrival of the queen, but with the discovery of the forgotten broken one. The night passed slowly, and the stars began to fade, and the first light of dawn touched the edge of the buildings, and inside the small garage, David sat beside the alien woman, who was now resting on a folded blanket and wrapped in an old jacket, and she was breathing slow and quiet, and her skin was still cold but not shaking anymore, and her wounds were still there, but her face looked peaceful, like she had finally escaped a nightmare. David did not sleep, and he kept checking her breathing and whispering words that he knew. She did not understand, but still he spoke because it felt like the right thing to do, and sometimes words are not about understanding, but about comfort. And he said things like, "You are safe now, and I won't let anyone hurt you again, and I don't know who you are, but you don't have to be afraid." The TV in the corner kept showing clips of the Queen, and how she met world leaders, and how people built temples and golden stages for her, and how she sat in the middle like a goddess, and smiled and spoke in beautiful words, and every nation was offering something, and every camera was pointing at her, and she looked perfect and powerful and bright, like a dream made of light. But David's eyes were not on the Queen, and his hands were not building shrines, and his mind was on the alien woman, whose name he still did not know, and whose past was still a mystery. But something in his heart told him that she mattered more than all the lights and gold and cameras. When the sun was high and warm, rays came through the garage window. The alien woman finally opened her eyes, and her pupils were not round, but long and dark like a cat's, and they shimmered like stars in a lake. And she looked around in confusion and fear, and tried to sit up, but her body was weak, and she fell back with a small cry. And David rushed to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "It's okay, you are safe now, and I won't hurt you." She stared at him with eyes full of memory and sorrow, and her lips moved slowly like they were trying to remember how to speak. And finally she whispered a sound that was soft and broken and full of weight, and she said, "Queen Destroyer, not Savior." And her voice cracked, and her breath shook, and her face twisted in pain. David felt a chill run through his body, and he looked at her and asked, "What do you mean?" And she closed her eyes, and tears slipped from the corners, and she tried to speak again, but only silence came, and she turned her head away and curled into herself like a child hiding from monsters in the dark. He knew she had seen something terrible, and he knew her pain was real, and not something that could be explained on a news channel or written in a book. And he knew that the Queen might not be what she seemed, and he whispered to himself, "What if we are all looking at the wrong light?" And he gently placed a bowl of warm soup near her and wrapped the blanket tighter around her and said, "Rest, I will be here when you wake." Outside, the world continued to dance and sing and build towers for the Queen, and artists made paintings, and children wore masks that looked like her, and stories were told of how she would bless the human race, and how she would choose a man to stand beside her as king, and how Earth would finally become part of the galactic family. But in a dark alley, not far from that golden dream, a secret was hiding, and the truth was whispering, and it had chosen David as its only listener. And the stars seemed to flicker and watch in silence, like they knew that something old was waking again, and something broken was trying to become whole. Later that evening, the woman opened her eyes again, and this time they were clearer and stronger, and she looked at David and said, I broke the chains. I was not supposed to escape, but I did, and now I am hunted, and if they find me they will take me back and erase me, and I will be nothing again." Asked her, "What is your name?" And she hesitated, and then said, "Nira," and her voice was like a soft wind that carried memories from a dying world. And David said, "My name is David, and you are safe with me." And Nira looked at him with a strange expression, like she could not believe someone was being kind without asking anything in return. Night came again, and Nira sat up slowly and looked at the stars through the window, and David handed her a cup of water, and she took it with shaking hands and said, "Thank you." And he smiled and said, "Anytime." And outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the Queen's ship blinked high in the sky like an eye that never sleeps, and deep inside that ship the Queen opened her glowing eyes and whispered one word, David. Secrets of the sky. Sky was painted with orange and violet as the sun began to fall behind the city skyline, and inside the small garage David stood quietly while Nira sat on a folded blanket, her hands resting on her knees, and her eyes staring not at the wall in front of her, but at something far away, something beyond this world and beyond this moment. She had not spoken much since morning, and David had not pushed her. He knew that some words come only when the silence is ready to let them through, and finally when the shadows grew longer and the light became softer. Nira took a deep breath and said, "I want to show you." David walked closer and sat down beside her and said, "Show me what?" And Nira looked at him and raised her right arm and pulled up the sleeve of the loose cloth David had wrapped around her, and there on her skin, hidden beneath a thin, transparent layer, was a strange glowing pattern like a circuit made of light and veins and stars. She pressed 2 fingers gently on the glowing pattern, and suddenly the garage filled with soft blue light, and the air grew thick like fog made of memory, and pictures began to form around them, floating and moving and alive like dreams woven into reality. And David stared with wide eyes as Nira whispered, "These are my memories." The first image was of a massive palace made of living stone and golden roots, and it stood on top of a floating island in the middle of a purple sky, and thousands of alien beings walked below the palace, all of them silent and expressionless like puppets without souls, and above them all stood the queen, her body shining brighter than the sun, and her eyes glowing with control. She would speak, and the people would bow, and she would raise her hand, and they would obey without question. And in that world, no one asked why, no one resisted, no one dreamed because dreaming was forbidden, and hope was a weakness. And Nira said, "I was one of them. I was a servant. I was born inside the palace and trained to obey her voice." And never think David watched as the next image showed a younger Nira, scrubbing the walls of a giant hall while others walked past her without speaking, and their eyes were dull and gray. And every movement was perfect and robotic, and a sudden scream echoed through the memory, and Nira flinched as a guard dragged a small alien child out of a room and vanished into a dark door, and she whispered, "They took away those who remembered how to feel." But one day something changed, and another servant whispered a story to Nira in secret, and it was a story about the world beyond the Queen's empire, and about a planet called Earth, and about people who still made mistakes and still asked questions and still dreamed. And Nira had never heard of such a place, and her heart began to ache for something she could not name. The image changed again, and this time Nira was running through long tunnels beneath the palace, carrying a small glowing stone in her hands, and alarms were ringing, and lights were flashing red, and the walls screamed warnings in strange languages, and behind her came the sound of guards chasing her, and their boots hitting the ground like thunder, and their voices shouting her name. She reached a hidden chamber and placed the stone into a strange pod, and the pod opened like a flower and swallowed her, and then everything went dark and cold and endless, and Nira whispered, "I slept for years in the dark of space until your planet pulled me in, and the pod burned and broke, and I fell." The images disappeared, and the blue light faded, and the garage was quiet again, and David sat there trying to understand what he had just seen. And Nira looked at him and said, "She is not what she seems. The queen does not want peace. She wants control. She chooses one human not for love, but to make the rest obey through him. She will own this world." David looked at her and asked, "Why me? Why does she want me?" And Nira said, "Because you did not bow, you ignored her light, and that makes you dangerous. And if she cannot control you, she will destroy you and use your image to control others. And the ceremony they are planning is not a gift, it is a trap." He stood up and walked across the room and looked out through the small window at the sky, and he could still see the Queen's ship high above, glowing like a star. But now that light felt different. Now it felt like an eye watching everything and waiting and hiding something dark. David turned back to Nira and said, "Then what do we do?" And Nira reached inside her torn cloth and pulled out a small crystal device that pulsed with a blue rhythm, and she said, "This is the only thing that can stop her, but it must be taken into the heart of the living ship and placed in the Queen's root core, and only then can her control be broken." David looked at the crystal, then at Nira, and he nodded slowly and said, "Then we go. The choice goes public." The sun rose over world changed by light and lies, and across every country and city and village the voice of the Queen echoed like a sweet song through screens and speakers and dreams, and it spoke with grace and power and said, "The time has come, and one human must Now be chosen, and he shall rise as king beside the Queen of Stars. People danced in the streets, and giant statues were being built in airships, flew with banners showing the Queen's face, and children sang her name, and men wore silver robes, and women painted their eyes like hers, and every leader in every nation held meetings and debates and celebrations to honor the coming union. The Queen's ship grew brighter in the sky like a second sun, and her message played again and again, and she said, I will choose one who is not the strongest or the richest, but one who holds purity in his heart and clarity in his soul. And all eyes turned to David. His photo had spread across the world after someone recorded him near the alley where Nira had first appeared, and rumors followed him like shadows, and people said he ignored the Queen's call, and he must be the one, and he must be special, and journalists came to his street and shouted his name, and camera drones flew over his garage like flies searching for gold. But inside that small garage, David sat in silence, and Nira stood beside him holding the crystal device, wrapped in an old cloth, and her hands were shaking, not from fear but from memory, and her eyes were watching the world go mad outside while her heart whispered truth that no one else seemed to hear. David said, why are they choosing for me? I never asked for this, and I never wanted to be a symbol. And Nira said, because they do not understand. They see her light and think it is love, but they do not feel the heat beneath it. They do not see the chains she hides in her smile. Doors shook as someone knocked, and a voice called, David, please come out. We want to speak to you. The world wants to see you. And behind that voice were cameras and lights and fake smiles and plastic promises. But David did not move, and Nira touched his arm and whispered, soon they will stop asking, and they will start taking. That night, David and Nira moved in secret through the lower parts of the city, wearing old clothes and hiding their faces, and the streets were filled with glowing screens showing images of the Queen, and everywhere people were preparing for the final event, the great choosing ceremony where the Queen would appear in full form and call her human king to stand beside her. Posters showed David's face next to the Queen's, and artists painted giant murals of them holding hands, and the world cheered and the leaders smiled. But David walked with his head low and his mind heavy and his heart full of questions he could not shake. They reached an abandoned building far from the city lights, and inside was an old alien signal station left behind from a forgotten time, and Nira activated a small panel hidden beneath the dust, and the walls lit up with blue light, and a map of the Queen's ship appeared showing its living tunnels and its root core pulsing like a heart. David looked at the map and asked, how do we get inside? And Nira said, tomorrow, during the ceremony, all gates will open to welcome the chosen one, and if you walk with the others, you can reach the inner chamber and place the device. And once it connects, the Queen's control net will collapse and the ship will lose its voice. Looked at the glowing map, and then at Nira, and he said, what if she sees me, and what if she stops me? And Nira said, then you must not stop, because she fears you not because of your strength, but because of your choice. And if you choose to resist her, she cannot force the others to follow. The next morning, the world gathered beneath the floating ship, and every screen on Earth turned to the sky, and the Queen appeared not as a hologram but in full living form, and her light touched every face. And her voice said, today, I welcome my partner. Come to me, and take your place. David stepped forward through the crowd, wearing a long gray cloak, and behind him walked silent guards, and golden drones and cameras followed every move, and cheers rose from the people, and some wept, and some prayed, and some stood frozen in awe. But the Queen watched only him, and her smile was wide and warm, and her eyes burned with something hidden and old and sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. And she opened her arms and said, David, you are the one, and you have been chosen. David looked at her, then looked at Nira, who stood hidden in the shadow of the gate, and her eyes met his, and she nodded once, and in that moment, David knew what he had to do. He walked toward the Queen with the weight of the world behind him and the truth of another beside him, and beneath the light that blinded billions, a quiet resistance began to rise into the beast. The gates of the living ship opened like the mouth of a sleeping beast, and its breath rolled out in waves of warm wind that smelled like metal and flowers and forgotten rain, and David stepped forward as the crowd behind him screamed his name and threw petals and blessings, and his face was calm, but his heart pounded like thunder trapped inside his chest. The queen stood at the center of the platform with her arms raised, and her silver robe floated like smoke, and her eyes glowed with ancient fire, and her voice danced through the minds of every soul watching, and she said, "Welcome, chosen one, enter the sacred heart, and rise as king beside me." And her voice felt like honey mixed with fire. David walked slowly along the golden bridge that led into the ship, and each step echoed through the hollow structure like a whisper of fate, and he could feel the ship watching him, not with cameras or wires, but with living nerves and thoughts and breath, and every wall around him pulsed with soft light, like a heartbeat waiting for a command behind him. The entrance closed, and silence wrapped around him like a blanket of shadows, and ahead the path curved and narrowed, and the lights grew dimmer, and the air heavier, and the world outside vanished like a forgotten dream, and David whispered to himself, "We are inside now." In his hand was the small crystal device wrapped in cloth and warm with silent energy, and in his mind was Nira's voice repeating the instructions again and again. "Find the root core, place the crystal before she connects with you. Do not speak, do not stop, and if you hear her voice, shut your thoughts, close your heart, and walk." He moved through the glowing tunnel, and the walls shimmered with symbols that shifted like living ink, and sometimes he thought he heard voices calling his name from inside the walls, and sometimes he saw faces smiling and crying and vanishing, and he kept walking because he knew the ship was not just alive, it was a mirror of every fear and desire ever touched by the queen. Far behind him, hidden in the servant tunnel, Nira crawled through narrow passages where the light was dim and the walls were cold and wet and filled with memory, and she held her breath every time a pulse of sound moved through the structure, and she followed a map etched into her mind from her years inside this place, and she whispered, "Not again, never again." David reached a chamber shaped like a spiral heart, and in the center stood a pillar of light, and floating veins wrapped around it like roots, and it pulsed slowly with blue and red and green, and it was beautiful and alive and breathing, and he knew this was the root core, and he stepped closer with the crystal burning in his hand. But before he could place it, the voice came not from behind, not from above, but from inside. And it was her voice, and it was soft and gentle, and full of sorrow and dreams. And the queen said, "Why are you afraid, David? Why do you run from light, and why do you trust the broken one who carries only pain and lies?" David clenched his teeth and moved closer, and she said, "I see your memories, I see your childhood, I see your loneliness and your strength, and I see the love you carry and the fear you hide, and I can give you peace, I can give you more than you ever dreamed." Light around the pillar began to change, and the walls turned gold and warm, and the smell of his childhood home filled the chamber, and he saw his mother smiling and his father laughing, and the street where he learned to ride a bike, and the voice said, "You do not have to fight, just choose me, and I will make the pain end." His knees bent and his hand trembled, and the crystal almost fell, and he saw himself standing beside the queen, and the world smiling and the stars opening like flowers, and he heard the voice again whispering, "You were meant to be more, and you were born to lead, and this is your destiny." Then another voice broke through the dream, and it was quiet and rough and real, and it was Nira calling his name, and he saw her face, not glowing, not perfect, but scarred and tired and brave and true, and he remembered her hands shaking as she spoke of chains and fire, and he remembered the way she smiled when he gave her water and warmth. David stood tall again, and he stepped forward and tore the cloth from the crystal and the light inside. It flared like a second sun, and he shouted, "Not for power, not for glory, but for truth," and he placed the crystal into the root, and the ship screamed. The walls turned black and the lights flickered, and every root pulled back, and the spiral heart convulsed like it was dying, and the queen's voice turned sharp and cold, and she said, "You fool, you know not what you destroy." But David stood silent and watched the core pulse one last time, and then collapse into light. Far Below, Nira felt the wave of freedom rush through the tunnels, and she cried without sound, and above the sky darkened as the living ship began to fall. Real power. The living ship trembled as if the stars themselves had touched its heart, and every wall shook with the sound of something ancient breaking, and the lights inside turned from gold to red, then to cold flickering white, and David stood at the center of the spiral chamber, with the crystal device glowing beside him like a final breath of truth. And around him the roots twisted and recoiled like snakes in fire. The queen's voice came again, but this time it was not smooth or soft or royal. It cracked like glass under pressure, and thunder hidden in silk, and she said, "You do not understand what you have done. You broke the link between my mind and the ship, and you stole my voice, and now you will drown in the silence." David did not move, and his eyes locked on the pillar, now dark and pulsing slower than before. And he knew the ship was dying, not like a machine, but like a beast losing its heart. And he heard the queen's footsteps as she entered the chamber, her glowing form still wrapped in silver, and her eyes burning like a dying sun. And she said, "I gave you a chance to become legend, and you chose to disappear." She raised her hand, and the walls behind her opened, and light poured in, and shadows crawled behind it. And from the shadows came guards, not human, not alien, but shapes made of bone and metal and sorrow, and they stepped forward with long blades and empty faces. And she said, "Bow, and I will forgive your ignorance. Resist, and I will erase you from every memory and every mind." David looked at the guards, then at the queen, and then at the crystal, and said, "I made my choice before you ever spoke, and I do not need your forgiveness, and I will not bow." And the queen's eyes narrowed, and her smile disappeared, and the silver around her cracked like old paint, and her skin beneath began to shift. She stepped forward, and her voice dropped lower and deeper, and she said, "You think I am darkness, but I am order. I am the silence that follows chaos. I am the hand that shapes the stars, and I offered you everything, but your heart was too small, and your vision too human, and now you will witness what you denied." As she walked, her body changed, her beauty faded, her form stretched and expanded, and the walls around her bent, and the queen became her true self, a being made of tendrils and eyes and jagged wings, her face now a mask of light and shadow, and her voice a screen folded in music. David took a step back, but then he heard movement behind him and turned to see Nira limping through the opposite entrance, her arms scratched, her clothes torn, but her eyes focused and strong. And she said, "It is not too late. She is weak now. The ship cannot hold her form for long. If we break her bond completely, she will fall." The queen turned, and her tendrils rose like whips, and her many eyes locked onto Nira, and she said, "You dare return here? After what you stole from me, you were nothing, a tool, a shadow, a crack in my perfect mirror, and now you come to break what little remains." Nira did not flinch, and she walked to David and said, "The ship is alive, but afraid. It wants freedom, but does not know how to let go. We must show it that it can survive without her." And David nodded and placed his hand on the crystal again, and Nira placed her hand beside his, and together they whispered words not of command but of comfort. The roots around the chamber began to glow and shift, and they no longer pulled away. They reached toward the light from the crystal and wrapped around it, not to crush but to connect. And the ship shuddered once more, but this time it was not pain, it was release, and something deep within it exhaled for the first time. The queen screamed, and her body began to unravel, the silver peeling away, the light collapsing into shadow. And she said, "No, I am the voice, I am the center, I am the root. You cannot survive without me." But the ship did not listen, and the walls opened like wings, and light filled the chamber, and her form began to break. Her eyes flickered, and her voice faded, and her final words were not of hate or threat, but of confusion. And she said, "Why did you not choose me?" And her form burst into dust and scattered like stars, falling into memory. Silence fell, but it was not empty, it was peaceful, and the light in the ship turned soft, and the roots stopped moving, and the walls became still, and David and Nira stood side by side, breathing slowly, and the crystal dimmed and faded and became part of the floor. They looked at each other, and neither smiled, but in their eyes was something Knew not victory, not power, but understanding, and Nira whispered, "She is gone," and David said, "No, she is not gone, she is free, and maybe now the ship is too far above the sky changed." And the Queen's ship slowly began to lower itself, not crashing, but descending like a creature, no longer angry or lost. And across the world, the screens turned black and the music stopped, and people looked up in silence, unsure what had happened. But knowing something had ended and something else had begun. A new dawn. The sky above the city was no longer glowing with power or fear, and the ship that once burned like a second sun now floated quietly like a cloud, unsure of where it belonged, and inside its walls. The roots had stilled and the lights had softened, and no voices echoed from its core, and no commands were spoken through its breath. David stood on the edge of the opening where once the Queen had stood like a goddess wrapped in silver and promises, and now that place was empty, and behind him Nira sat quietly on the floor, her back against the wall, and her eyes closed as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Air smelled of ash and memory and silence, and David looked at the crystal embedded in the floor, and then at Nira and said, "Is it over?" And Nira opened her eyes slowly, and said, "It is not the end. It is the beginning. The ship will choose what it wants to be, and Earth will need time to understand what it almost became." They walked together down the long, glowing hallway that now pulsed not with command, but with breath, and as they reached the ship's outer gate, it opened like a curtain revealing the world outside, still waiting, still silent, still unsure, and David could see the crowd below standing, with eyes wide and hands still not clapping, not shouting, just watching. News drones hovered above the scene like confused birds, unsure of what they should capture, and the faces of world leaders flashed on giant screens, all of them speaking at once, and none of them making sense, and the Queen was gone, and her promise vanished, and the story had broken open like a dream. Melting into morning, David and Nira stepped onto the floating platform, and the ship lowered them slowly toward the earth, and the wind passed through their hair, and the light of a new day touched their skin. And when their feet touched the ground, the people began to move, not in anger, not in celebration, but in quiet wonder. Someone asked what happened, and someone else whispered, "Is she really gone?" And a small child reached out and touched Nira's hand and said, "Are you the Queen now?" And Nira knelt and said, "No. I am just someone who chose to run when it hurt, and someone who learned that hiding does not heal, but truth does." David looked at the crowd, then at the sky, and said, "We were given a choice, and we almost gave it away. But now we have it back, and we must protect it, not with fear, not with power, but with kindness and questions and courage to say no when something feels wrong, even if it shines like gold." The world did not cheer, but the silence felt full like the pause before a song, and the air carried a softness that had not been there before, and slowly the people began to return to their homes, and the cameras powered down, and the golden banners were taken down, and the giant statues of the Queen were left to crack in the rain. David and Nira walked away from the platform with no one stopping them, no guards, no officials, no lights. Just the sound of their footsteps and the rhythm of their hearts finding peace again. And as they reached the edge of the city, Nira looked back once and said, "I never thought I would leave that ship and live to feel the wind again." David smiled gently and said, "You are free now." And she said, "I do not know what to do with freedom." And he said, "We will learn together, one day at a time, one choice at a time." They found shelter in an old cottage at the edge of the forest where the air was clean, and the birds sang without fear, and the stars were visible at night, and no ships blocked the sky. And Nira began to plant flowers in the soil, and David fixed broken things left behind by people who had moved away, and slowly the world began to feel real. Again letters came from across the planet, people asking questions, not about the Queen, not about the power, but about the truth, about the silence that followed, and about the woman who once was hidden in an alley, and now stood beneath the sun with dirt on her hands and light in her eyes. Nira wrote her story with simple words, and David helped her. And the book was not sold in shops, but passed from hand to hand and read in whispers, and shared in schools, and the children did not draw the Queen In their notebooks anymore, they drew stars and gardens and two figures standing side by side, one with scars and one with tools. One night under a sky full of stars, David sat beside Nira and asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had chosen the queen?" And Nira looked up at the stars and said, "She offered you the universe, but I only offered you honesty, and still you chose me." And David nodded and said, "Because power can blind, but pain can teach." The wind moved through the trees like a soft voice, and the ship in the sky slowly drifted farther into space, as if it knew its time here had passed, and the earth turned quietly and a new dawn rose, not with music or noise, but with peace and the simple breath of a planet that had remembered how to listen, and that was enough.